All right. And so like Blair said, I would love it if you ask questions as I'm going. Please don't feel like you have to hold on to them until the end, because I set this up from beginning to end, starting with, defining what an assessment instrument is and what you might use it for, how you develop it, how you validate it, and how you evaluate your results and how you interpret the results. So the whole range is there, and I don't know exactly where your interest lies and where you want me to go more in depth and where you don't. So I would love it if people, pop in and ask questions, or even tell me now what you're hoping to get out of this, so I can make sure to focus on those areas. And if you do use the chat box, I'm terrible at watching that and trying to present. So if somebody, Blair.
I'll help with that. Don't worry.
Thank you. Because I did a virtual presentation once before, and all the discussion was on chat, and I was supposed to be watching that while I presented, and I couldn't do it. So, but if you want to jump in and ask verbal questions, no problem. And then we can have a conversation and talk through it. But I'm very happy with people stopping me at any point. And I'll try to keep this. I set it up so it's probably right around 40 minutes of stuff, but also you can jump in if, this is a section you don't want me to go through. And I have an overview here so you can see what I plan on doing. So the idea was I was going to start by, I framed this talk around a paper that Carl Wyman and I wrote about how to develop formative assessment instruments. And we called it a FOSSI, Formative Assessment of Instruction. And so that would cover both concept inventories or any kind of content evaluation and perceptions instruments, including things like the CLAS. And so I'm going to define what they are and why you'd want to use them, then talk about the development and validation. And that's probably the bulk of what I have put together. And then interpretation. And I have some examples of different ways you can look at the data. It's really not just about one number. You don't just get a score and know how you did. There's a lot of ways to look at it, and a lot of different meaning that can be pulled from your results. So that's what I plan on talking about. So formative assessment of instruction. I'm going to use two color codings here. Green is for content instruments. So something like the FCI or the BIMA, or anything that asks about the actual content you're teaching in your course. That's going to be typically a multiple choice instrument. Here's some examples. Assessment of perceptions. And so an example, that's typically going to be a Likert scale type instrument. So the CLAS, there's CLAS for physics, for chemistry, for math, for biology. And I don't know, Blair, what the content is of all the folks that are on. Is it all different sciences? Is it math? Is it?
Looks at physics, engineering, biology, physics. Okay.
Yeah, so whole range.
Whole range, math, yeah.
Okay. All right. So some of my examples here, the alphabet soup above is mostly physics ones I listed, but clearly there are examples in different disciplines. And there are disciplines like engineering and some others that are really young in this field. So there's a lot of areas where things can be developed. And you all are probably in the best position to be doing that. And the PTAP is a new one that we just did on the perceptions of teaching as a profession. And that's aimed at people who might become science and math teachers. So that's another very different example of a perceptions instrument. It was built exactly the same way. So for a content instrument, here's just an example. I'll come back to this question later, but this just gives you an example of a really informative concept question. So I'll let you guys read it. I don't need to read it to you. So I'll give you just a minute, well, a little bit less than that, to kind of read through it. And then I'll let you kind of answer it on your own. Normally I would have people vote just for fun, but I don't know how we would do that on here. It's probably not worth the time, but answer it in your own mind. We will come back to this in a few minutes. But it's just an example so you can see a concept question, a content question. It doesn't have to just be about concepts. Now for perception statements, here are a couple of examples. These are from the CLAS, or the first one's from the CLAS. After I study a topic in physics and feel that I understand it, I have difficulty solving problems on the same topic. And oops, animation is a little bit screwed up. And then it's Likert scale, so a person agrees or disagrees. strongly agree, strongly disagree. An example from the PTAP, I would become a grade 7 through 12 teacher if the pay were equal to my other career options. And then, so it just gives you a concrete example of each type. But they're developed very similarly. And so the value, why do you want to do this? Well, for instructors, typically instructors agree that students, well, always instructors agree that students should be able to answer these questions. And they expect the students value the subject in their daily life. They expect the students to have healthy attitudes about how to learn the subject. So that's what the perceptions instruments are for. That's why that one's in purple. For students, they do poorly on these concept tests when they enter the course. They disagree with experts on the subject applying to daily life and how to learn. And we don't want them to do that. We want them to learn the beauty of our discipline and why it's interesting and how it applies to their daily life. And these, both the concepts and the perceptions are remarkably stubborn. Conceptual understanding doesn't change much after instruction. And often the perceptions about applying to daily life or how to learn the material gets less expert-like after instruction. So it's actually considered a win on things like the CLAS if you can hold their perceptions steady after a semester of your course, especially if it's the first course in the discipline, if it's the introductory course. So that kind of gives you the motivation behind having them. There are other survey tools you could do if you want to ask questions about how the course went. Things are real specific to your course. And I typically don't go through the whole development and validation procedure for those kinds of questions. And if you all have questions about that kind of survey, we can definitely talk about that, and I'll tell you how I do mine and what my rationale is for not following all the same procedures for those kinds of questions. So that's just defining it. Now I want to talk about the development and validation. I'm starting with the references because these all draw from these two main resources: the American Educational Research Association, the APA, the American Psychological Association, and the National Council for Measurement and Education put together this book that is the standards for educational and psychological testing. And I have quoted the reference here 1999, but there's also a newer version that's something new since like 2015, I think. I've looked at the sections that apply. They're really similar, but I have not read through that whole book. So I'm referencing 99 because I know that one like the back of my hand. And then near the same timing, the National Research Council did a study on assessments and came out saying that, we really need to do a better job with our assessments, and we need to take what is known about cognitive psychology and tie it in with the typical old school ways of making survey instruments and standardized tests. And that basically meant bringing in student interviews, because previous advice was really based heavily on statistical analyses and didn't take into account student interviews. And so much can be learned. For me, in my experience, you learn so much more from the student interviews than every statistical analysis that you could possibly imagine. So why not go directly and find out? Why not watch the students think about these problems and work through them and actually see what's happening, as opposed to trying to guess by doing a bunch of statistics and looking at the math and trying to figure out what that might maybe mean about what the student was thinking. So we wrote this paper that combined the standards and the recommendations from the National Research Council. And this has generally been how most assessment instruments in discipline-based education research have been developed in the last 10 years. So I'll give you kind of the formal phases, and then we'll get into some more like applicable, real concrete things. So first, you need to delineate the purpose of your test. What's the scope of the construct or constructs, the extent of the domain you want to measure. So you need to narrow down your learning objectives. And then development and evaluation of the test specifications. So for a FOSSI, a formative assessment of instruction, I would argue that those test specifications are pretty well defined for all types of formative assessment of instruction. And I will have a slide here in a minute that tells you what I think those are. Phase 3 is development, field testing, evaluation, selection of the items and scoring guides and procedures. And 4 is assembly and evaluation of the test for operational use. So the bulk of the work is 3 and 4, and they really happen together. And so that's the bulk of what I'm going to explain here in the next probably 15 or 20 minutes. So I'm going back now to those test specifications that I told you I would tell you why I argue that they're pretty much the same for all of your surveys. So item format, you want something forced answer, because these need to be something that are easy for different faculty to use and always consistent in how they're scored, so that you can make comparisons between courses, and either with your own course from year to year, or between instructors who teach different sections of the course, or between different institutions that are teaching the same course. So you need to have something straightforward to score and very consistent in how it's scored. So it needs to be forced answer. Clearly, there are some things that you lose if you don't have open-ended questions. But for this sort of assessment instrument, because of the motivations behind being able to compare different instruction, this is really probably the best way and the most efficient way to go. Desired psychometric properties, so it's low stakes. It's not a test that determines whether somebody's going to get into medical school. And you're going to select a few concepts or perceptions. You're not going to try to cover all of your learning objectives from the semester in one 30-minute, forced answer test. You're going to pick a few main areas that you want to focus on, and you're going to ask students about those. And then time restrictions. Well, if it's a concept or a content type test, it's got to fit into a class period to be realistically used by different instructors. If it's a perceptions instrument, it really needs to be about 10 minutes, or you're going to have people just not finish it. 10 minutes is about the most you can ask them to do, or you start getting poor completion rates. And it also can be given online when it's that sort of instrument, so 10 minutes. Once it's longer than that, people start multitasking, and you get people who aren't completing it for a couple hours when it's because they're not really on task. And then characteristics of the population. You'll know who your population is depending on what the course is. If it's an upper division physics course, you're going to know it's going to be physics majors who are taking this course. So you'll figure those things out in advance, and they're all pretty much the same for a formative assessment of instruction. And then test procedures. Well, if it's content, you're going to do pre-post because you want to see how things changed. If it's perception instrument, you might just do one time to look at a population. But all those things are sort of consistent, even if across discipline.
Hey, Wendy?
Yes.
So I have a quick question when it comes to the stakes. Is there any sort of bias that you have to consider that gets introduced if students get points for doing the pre-post and that kind of stuff, or does that not matter?
Yeah, we've had a lot of discussions about this. If you want to be comparing to other results from other institutions across the country, then you really need to have it be low stakes and not have it be the final exam or have it count as an exam. Because once you do that, you introduce a motivation to the students to study. And you're also not supposed to share. Good practice is to not share the questions with the students, because then the questions get out and it makes people very nervous about whether people would study the test. And even when it doesn't count as a grade, a lot of faculty are nervous that students might have gotten a hold of the questions and seen them in advance. But when you make it not count as a grade, students just don't go look for it because they don't care. But if you make it count as a grade, they'll go look for it. And so that's, I think, my main arguments for not having it count as a grade. You could, and if you give it in class, typically you would get good participation rates. You could also give points just for completion. But once you give points, like grade the actual questions, I think there's problems with the validity and comparing yourself to other institutions. I wouldn't feel comfortable comparing my data to somebody who made it their final exam, because I just don't think that's the same setup. That's what you were asking, right?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Are there other questions here? Since we're
sure. I'll chime in. It's Stephanie.
Hi.
Hey, because I bet that other people are also curious, like how you incentivize people to take these tests. Do you have, other than points, do you have other suggestions on how to take them, have the students take the test seriously?
I've always just given it in class and just told the students, I give them a little bit of an introduction as to why I'm doing it. I just tell them that that we're doing this because it helps us see in the beginning, I tell them it helps us see what you know and what you don't know, so that we're not spending time during the semester teaching you things that you already know. Even though I personally already have enough data to know that they don't know this material, but I still tell them that. I think that is kind of a respectful thing to offer to them. And then, so I ask them to do their very best, because that helps us know. And it also is important to us because it helps us evaluate our course and what we've done. So we're going to ask them to take it again at the end of the semester. And it helps us see if we're doing a good job of teaching them the material and helping them learn the material. That's really all I do. And I haven't seen evidence that people aren't taking it seriously. They take the whole amount of time, and afterwards they talk to you about, oh, I wish I'd known that, or I thought I knew this. Or with the FCI, for example, they all think they did really well, and they didn't. So they come out feeling quite good, but then they figure it out during the semester that they didn't actually know that. So that's all I've done for the concept tests. And then for perceptions instruments, I always offer points, or else they won't do it, or there are people who will just click through. And so, but if they do, I have ways to call them out and just not use their data. But I just offer points for them to complete it. Extra credit points is my main thing I use for the perceptions instruments. If you don't offer points on those, like for the PTAP, we get a 5 or 10% completion rate if you just send it out and you don't offer something. But if you do it as part of a class and you offer points, pre and post matched, I end up with about 85%.
Okay, awesome, thanks.
Sure. Any other questions? Okay, so feel free to jump in if one comes to mind. Don't feel like we've moved forward and you can't ask. So now I'm going to talk about 3 and 4, which pretty much are the bulk of the development and validation work. So I wanted to have just a little slide real quick on what validation is, because often I still hear people talk about how they validated their instrument, or they did this kind of validation or that kind of validation. And the standards book is very clear in saying that we collect evidence of validity. We don't validate our instrument, because if you validate your instrument, it's analogous to saying that you've proved something in science. And it's pretty hard to prove that something isn't. You would have to test every possible case to prove that something really is the way it is. But you collect evidence in support of a particular theory or idea that makes you feel more and more confident that that is actually how things work. And so we're going to collect evidence of validity for our instruments, and that evidence is going to come from the populations we have access to. If we don't have access to a particular population, we can't collect, it's unreasonable to collect evidence of validity with that population. So you can't say that it's validated because you haven't tested with every population. So just some wording that's important if you, when you write up a paper, about your instrument that you've developed. So some different areas that you might collect evidence on about the test content. How well does it represent the domain in question? So you can collect a lot of that from interviewing experts to see if they feel like it's representative of the domain. Evidence based on response processes. So if you're measuring reasoning, you want to make sure your test taker is using reasoning and not an algorithm to get their answer for a problem. So this is where student interviews come in, to see how they're solving the problems and to make sure it's actually measuring the thing that you think it's measuring. And before people started doing student interviews, they were often representing instruments as measuring something that in fact was not the way that students were completing it. So interviews are critical for figuring that out. You might collect evidence based on internal structure. Is it a single dimension? Is it several components? This is usually done through statistical analyses of large-scale data that you've collected. You might want to collect evidence based on relations to other variables. How are they doing on this compared to your final exam, or compared to how you feel like they're doing based on your interactions with them in the class, or compared to their grade in the class? Something else to help you feel confident that the test is actually measuring something that you also see in another way. So I'm going to lay out kind of the whole process of what you do with an instrument. So first, you're going to establish the topics that are important to teachers. And when you've made learning objectives for courses and the faculty have agreed on these learning objectives, you're there, that's done. Interviews and observations to identify student thinking and the ways it can deviate from expert thinking. So this could be observing, facilitating a help session for students around the topic and learning where they have trouble and where they have questions. It could be formal interviews with open-ended statements. It could be that you've taught the course for years and it's small enough that you have close interaction with the students, but some way to have mined the perceptions that students come in with about the conceptions, that the students come in with about the material. Create open-ended questions to probe student thinking more broadly, so then you can kind of collect some large-scale data on the open-ended questions, and then you can use those responses to see what the common misconceptions are, the common wrong answers, and then those common wrong answers become your multiple choice options. So then you'll create that forced answer test that has those options. And then now here's actually where probably a big chunk of the work comes in, is validation interviews with both novices and experts, administer to a course and to experts to make sure that they all agree on the correct answers, and then run statistical analyses on the data you get and modify as necessary. So this really means you're going to do expert interviews to figure out what topics are important. You're going to do student interviews or observations to learn what students are thinking. You're going to collect some data, and that'll help you create a forced answer test. So then you're going to modify your test to become multiple choice or Likert if you're doing a perceptions instrument. Now you're going to do more interviews. These interviews are really important. The student interviews here, you're going to do quite a few of these to make sure that they're interpreting the questions correctly, et cetera. And I have a whole slide on that. And then you're going to modify again, because those interviews are going to find some things that you did not expect. And I would be shocked if they didn't. I don't think I've ever heard of anybody doing student interviews and not have to modify statements. And then you're going to be able to feel confident that the statements are being interpreted well. You're going to go ahead and collect large scale data, do some statistical analyses, but then those statistical analyses are going to tell you some things that encourage you to either create some more questions or to retake out some questions. And if you modify it at all, you need to do some more student interviews to make sure that didn't impact how students are answering the questions that are still there. So there's kind of this iterative process. And so that's kind of that's sort of the whole process in a nutshell, but I will now go through slides that explain each of these steps. And then we'll go back to this slide to see if you feel like you have a good picture of how each of these steps work. So this is sort of our roadmap of where we're going.
I just want to chime in that this is just how to say, it's super prescient because a project that I'm working on has been using your paper to develop a concept inventory, and they just went through and were like, okay, we're doing our final validation interviews and we're pretty confident things aren't going to change, even though they'd already done interviews, and they're found all sorts of problems with their questions and had to go back and do, so I just wanted to sort of underline what you're saying, that just you get such rich information from those student interviews, and even when you think you're done, sometimes you find some issues that are really important to solve for the validity of the test.
I've been doing student interviews for 14 years now, and I still get surprised at things that I hear. And I don't think you can ever get to the point that you can do it without those.
And if people are working on these kinds of tests and want to do these kinds of student interviews, I actually developed a whole student interview training that I am happy to share with anybody.
Yeah, people always have questions about how to do student interviews, so that's good. It seems very nerve-wracking to do the student interviews. I know a lot of people who skip them or put them off because it's a big energy barrier. But then once you do a couple, super easy, and it's just, for me, it's just the go-to thing. I do them as quickly as I can. As soon as I can, I get into student interviews because I know that's where I'm going to get good information. So it's a little bit scary the first time, but once you do it, it's no problem. You'll love it. So just some basic pointers on how you develop content questions or what's important in content questions. So here's a quote from the National Research Council guidelines. It said that assessments should focus on making students' thinking visible to both their teachers and themselves, so that instructional strategies can be selected to support an appropriate course of future learning. So you want to make sure, the whole point is to get at student thinking. And that means you want to write straightforward questions with clear language. It's so important. The language is clear, the question is straightforward, it doesn't use too much scientific jargon, not too high a level of vocabulary, because you don't want students using their cognitive load trying to interpret your question. You want all of their cognitive load spent on the content, on the thing that you're trying to see if they understand. And this note is here about, for example, when you have a well-written concept evaluation and it's on things that are more introductory level, students think they understand this concept. So they come away feeling great. Straightforward question, they answer it. You don't have to worry about it being too easy if it's about the content you're teaching in your course, because that's why you're teaching it, because students don't actually understand it. Distractors, 3 to 5. Some people think you need to have 5 on every single question. It might make some of your statistical analyses a little bit cleaner, but I don't know of any actual validation reasons to have all the same number of distractors. I think it's actually, I know I can give you good arguments for why you don't want distractors there that don't serve a purpose, because they just are something else for students to read. They make it look longer and it takes more time. So you only want distractors that are actually useful, and useful in that they are commonly chosen. So you only want answer options that students want to choose. So if you have an answer option that students almost never choose, unless of course it's the right answer, get rid of it. It doesn't do you any good. Yes.
Yeah, sorry, Wendy. I was trying to ask you a question about, you were saying that students think they understand, but they don't. Do you at any point give them the sort of overall analysis of, like we do the FCI here, for example? Because do you ever get the case, for example, that students feel like, oh, I understand this, I get this, I don't need this class? Do you ever sort of face that issue?
No, I think because I try to create questions that are very similar to FCI questions so that they see them right away in the course. So right up front in class, they're confronted with clicker questions or problem sets that they do, group problem solving that they do in class. And right away they see that they actually don't know it. So okay. I try to set it up in class so that they see it immediately in the beginning of the unit, where I try to put the harder things in front of them right away in a very comfortable situation, low stakes. Nobody knows what they answered except for themselves, and then they get to see that they don't know. And I also put up the results of the whole class, so then they also see that the majority of the class doesn't know. So I try to use questions where 80% of the class gets it wrong. And so then they realize they're in the same boat as everybody else and they all have something to learn. So that's usually how I address it. I have had people ask me how they do on the FCI, and I have really skirted around that because I don't want to share the questions with them, and I don't know how I can share the results. How would it be valuable for me to tell them that they got a 20% on the FCI and I'm not willing to show them what they got wrong? So
yeah, I just didn't know if you gave like an overall, this is how the class did on average. This is, you know, yeah, I would hate for students to walk away being like totally confident and being like, well, I don't need to come to class, for example, because I already know all this. So that's why I was curious. I think you answered it though.
Okay. I've never had anyone who didn't show up like the second and third day of class, so I can get them then. I also don't go over the syllabus on the first day of class. We do stuff. I always use the first day of class to actually do physics or whatever I'm teaching. So that's another thing. I feel like going over the syllabus is just a waste of time, and I want them to see what the class is really going to be like. And I think that's another way you could do it. If you did real material on the first day of class, then you don't have to worry about them thinking that. Let's see. So we said the number of distractors really just depends on the number of common responses that you want to put out there for people to be able to choose. And you want to include common incorrect responses. So whatever they are, you'll figure that out from your work before this. You want to hit them all and have them on there. And that helps you because then you know what fraction of your students are thinking a certain thing. And that also helps the students because the answer they want to see is there, which is another reason why they sometimes come out thinking they did really well. And then do not include any options that are not commonly chosen. Okay, I already said that. For perception statements, it's good to quote things from experts of what you want them to say about the discipline, but I think it's even richer to quote things from that you've heard students say that you really don't like hearing. So the CLAS was written by me writing down all the statements that I had heard my students say over the years in physics about the discipline that just made me cringe and that I worked so hard to change their views on. And so, so that's a good way to come up with perception statements if you're going to write an instrument like that, or if you're going to modify the CLAS for your discipline. Think about the things in your discipline that they say that are so naive and really aren't representative of what the discipline is really like, or that aren't effective ways for them to learn the discipline. Those are good statements to have there. And then you can see if your instruction is doing a good job of clarifying those things for them and letting them see what it's really like. And then straightforward language, same as with the content. I really aim for 4th grade level language, and it's really not that low. 4th grade level is very, it allows you to write anything you want without complicating the language, because again, you don't want people misinterpreting the statements and you don't want people spending time trying to understand it. There is another instrument that was built right before the CLAS, and it's measuring the same types of things as the CLAS. It has a few less statements in the CLAS, and it takes 25 minutes for students to complete it. And the CLAS takes 7 to 8 minutes. And the difference is the level of the language. That other assessment is more sophisticated sounding, which was the aim of the authors. They wanted to be sophisticated. They wanted to be respectful to the students and write in a very sophisticated manner. But that means that the students spend, in that case, it's 4 times as much time interpreting the statements before they can answer them. And that's just not a good use of time. And I've never had anyone feel patronized or talked down to because of the straightforward language on the CLAS. Something that are common misconceptions about developing surveys, especially this kind of survey. People think that you need to have a positive and negative version of each statement. That is almost impossible to do. Every time I make a statement that I think is on the same topic or about the same thing, and whether it's positive and negative or both negative, they don't end up correlating that highly when I run the statistics and students take it. There's always seems like some sort of subtlety that comes out in interviews that makes a statement mean something a little bit different to the students and brings up some different ideas. And so also there's data now that shows that when you try to make, if you have too many questions about the same thing, I think you all have probably taken a survey where they ask you the same thing over and over and over in a slightly different way. And it's just super annoying. It's just a waste of your time. And there's data that shows that those instruments are actually less reliable and give you less, because they're giving you less accurate information, because people get frustrated and they quit answering them, or they purposefully answer them differently because they are irritated that they're being asked the same thing over and over. So that is not current practice. That's old school recommendations that has somehow just carried on through rumor that that's the way to do it. So you don't want to do that. And it doesn't need to be limited to one construct. So again, that old school recommendation was that you would only write your survey assessment or your content assessment about one specific construct. And a lot of the statistical analyses are developed to only work if it is one specific construct. But that would be really hard to evaluate your whole course if you had to pick one very narrow construct and use that to make claims about your instruction the whole semester. And so by doing the student interviews, your data is so much richer that you can have more than one construct. And in fact, we want that. On the CLAS, we have multiple categories that come out of factor analysis. So those are some kind of common misconceptions about surveys that you don't want to be holding on to. So student interviews. Stephanie again said she's got lots of information on how to do this. So this is just super basic. You think aloud interviews. What you do is you ask students to think out loud while they go through and take your test. And this way you can see if they're interpreting the questions or the statements consistently. That is the most important thing. And they'll surprise you on how they interpret things that you think are crystal clear. You want to make sure that they're agreeing with the expert for expert-like reasons. So for content, that means they're choosing the correct answer for the right reasons only. You'll never know. So quite often there'll be a question where they're able to get the right answer, but it's for completely wrong reasoning, and you don't want that. And then, of course, with perceptions instruments, they need to be agreeing with the expert for expert-like reasons. Student thinking when they disagree with the expert, you want to know why. Why are they disagreeing with you? Why don't they see it the way you do? Or why are they choosing the wrong answer? And it helps if they're choosing the wrong, item B, if it's wrong, everybody chooses that because they have the same misconception. That's very helpful if you can write it in that way. If they're choosing the wrong answer for a multitude of reasons and you don't know what it is, then that makes that much less informative to you. You just know they got it wrong, but you just really don't know why if they can choose that one for several reasons. It's about 30 interviews per version per population, but I say about because it depends on, at some point you're going to stop getting new information from the interviews. And then it's only valid, again, we talked about the validity, collecting evidence of validity for the populations that you used for the development and validation. So if you did development and validation at Harvard, it may not be valid at State U. So you want to do it with the populations that you're going to use it with. So back to this question. You remember this? Hopefully you remember what your answer was. And so typically students choose E, 1, 2, and 3. Very popular to say that there's a force by the hit. But if you look at the question, it says that they're asking, so there's a very strong wind. The person hits the ball, and as it passes over the net, so it's on her opponent's court, so it's nowhere near her. She can't be applying a force to the ball. But it's very popular because turns out students' definition of force is different than a physicist's definition of force. Force is something that uses an everyday language, and it comes with a different, much broader definition in everyday language than it does in the physics community, but it's an important term in physics, and we have to use it. And so we have to teach students the narrow, precise, specific definition of force before they can do these problems, and this is a whole huge section of physics. It's important. And something else that's troublesome for students is to think about a moment in time as opposed to the whole scenario. And that surprised me. It took interviews and it took class discussions for me to find out that that was troublesome for people, because it's just something that I have been able to do as long as I can remember. So it's hard to imagine that somebody sees this whole scenario playing out that happens over 2 seconds as one instant, and they can't break it apart into pieces. And the correct answer is actually C, 1 and 3, a downward force of gravity. Gravity is always there, and then the wind is blowing, so there's clearly a force exerted by the air. And you can see a very small fraction of students on the pretest choose that. So that makes this a really great question. Option A isn't a very good distractor. The FCI, they feel like they needed 5 of everything. It's got all sorts of distractors that just never get chosen. And I would argue that we shouldn't keep them. So interview's fine. The definition of force is a problem. Students feel like it needs a force to be moving, so they're mixing up force with energy or with momentum. And then clarity of timing. So that's an example of why interviews are important. Here's another example. Now this is kind of a bad example. A large box is pulled with a constant horizontal force. As a result, the box moves across a level floor at a constant speed. And then there's a couple more questions. And then this question comes along. I'll let you read it. I want to make sure you kind of process it and get it in your head. Okay, and hopefully you've picked an answer you like. So this is another question where almost everybody gets it wrong. Even on post data, this question is typically below 10%, answered correctly by about 10% of the students on post data in most courses. People think that the speed will double because the force is doubled. So it turns out there are multiple problems and multiple reasons people get this problem wrong. I've interviewed on it many times, had class discussions on it, and when they get it wrong, I cannot tell you why they got it wrong. I can give you a range of reasons. They could have gotten it wrong because they don't understand there's a difference between constant speed and speeding up. Some students really don't get the difference between acceleration and speed. If something's going fast, it's going fast. And it could be going fast because you're getting on an on-ramp and you're speeding up, or it could be going fast because you're going 400 miles an hour in a plane. They really don't see the need to think about the difference between whether it's accelerating or whether it's just going fast. Net force results in an acceleration. That could be the problem. How can something just keep speeding up? A lot of students have trouble with that. This is a very abstract kind of question. You double the force and it's supposed to just keep speeding up. But in our real world, you can double the force on something for only a certain amount of time. What can you use that will continuously give you a double force as you're getting faster and faster? Because if you were pulling it, you can only run a certain speed. If you're pulling it with a car, the car can only go a certain speed. Like, it's just very unnatural to double the force on something. And how long is that time that's going by in the question? I don't know. So there are many reasons why someone would get this question wrong. So when they get this question wrong, it doesn't really inform me about my instruction. And at the end of the semester, when they're still getting the question wrong, they very easily could have come a long way on understanding the difference between speed and acceleration. They may get that a force causes an acceleration, but the unnaturalness of the scenario in this question still gets them. So, or they just may be not understanding any of these things. So I really don't know if my instruction did anything for these guys when it may have done a bunch or it may have done nothing. But this question doesn't tell me anything except if they get it right, they must hopefully have gotten all of these things figured out. And so it's a bad question in that respect. It may look like a good question when you look at the statistics and you say, oh, look, you know, it's doing a good job of getting people to choose the distractors. But it really isn't a good question for me to understand what's happening in my class and if I'm doing a good job. So you want to make sure this is a motivation for having the wrong answers be wrong for only one reason, that all the students use the same reasoning to pick that wrong answer, if you can. I mean, it's hard to get them all that way, but those are the best kinds of questions. Okay, so I was going to move on to statistical analyses. Are there any questions about the last few slides before I move on to defining reliability? Okay, hopefully that's good. Wait time is a lot easier when you can see people's faces. This is wait time with some little black boxes and names. Statistical analyses. Reliability. I want to talk about the definition of reliability because this is another place where there's a common misconception. So I think people understand that reliability means, are the results consistent? So there are actually three common forms of measuring reliability, which I think are not very familiar to people. There's alternate form coefficients. So if you make two parallel forms of the instrument and then you see if they're getting the same kind of results with the same population. So that's pretty hard to do because that means you have to split your class in half. You have to have two versions of the test and you want to see if the two versions are equivalent. So that's the kind of thing they do with test banks and the SAT and the MCAT. That's really, to me, well beyond what you want to do for something you're going to use in your class. Test, retest, or stability coefficients. So that means that you can give the test again with the exact same population in the exact same scenario. So that's a little bit hard because once you give it to students, they've seen it. So if you gave it again a week later, first of all, has there been a week of instruction? Did they learn some stuff? And did they maybe learn something by having had taken that test once before? So we have actually figured out how to do this when you have large classes. So at CU, we did this by giving it at the beginning of the semester to Physics 1 in the fall, beginning of the semester to Physics 1 in the spring, then in the following fall. So fall Physics 1 and fall Physics 1 the next year arguably are about as equivalent as you can get because they're huge classes. They're 400 people. The admission standards for the university are the same from year to year. And so you end up with these really quite equivalent populations. And so for the CLAS, for example, when we did that, we ended up with something like a 97% R value of the correlation between the results, one fall to the next. So populations should be the same. They should be in the same place in life because they're at the same date in the fall that they're starting their class, and they're all in the same class, so they should have the same set of majors. Now, if you do this with 50 people, it's going to be harder, but these are 400 people, so it washes out any specific characteristic, specific variations that might be there. It all becomes an average. So that's a way to do a test retest. Then there's internal consistency coefficients. So that's where you get Cronbach's alpha. Cronbach's alpha is what most people hear is what you're supposed to use for reliability. But the problem is Cronbach's alpha is designed to measure if you are testing a single construct. And we already talked about how that's not very practical to test a single construct with one of these assessments. So Cronbach's alpha is actually not meant to be used with anything like this. And Cronbach himself, one of the things he had a paper written, or a book, I can't remember, maybe it was a book. He dictated it to one of his colleagues or a student or something to write up when he was sick and he was dying. And one of the things he had in there was that he was frustrated that people were completely overusing alpha, and they were using it for so many situations that it did not apply to. And so if you look at what it is and how it's calculated, you'll see that it really doesn't fit our instruments. And so it's really not a good way to try to represent reliability. The best thing, if you can, is the large scale data with two different sets of the same students, for example, fall to fall. That's really the strongest thing you can get. And the standards book says that the ideal approach to the study of reliability entails independent replication of the entire measurement process. And so independent replication of the entire process would be fall of 2015 and then fall of 2016, as long as nothing changed about when the course was scheduled or what majors need to take the course or the admission standards for the university. And those things are all pretty steady at most institutions. So, and I say textbook cutoffs do not necessarily apply, because there's these textbook cutoffs for Cronbach's alpha, and then there's some stuff on the next slide I'll talk about too. And those only apply in a specific scenario that it was set up for, and we're not typically meeting those scenarios. We're not typically following all of those when we're trying to measure things in our courses. Okay, so then once you collect data and you're trying to validate your instrument, you're trying to see which statements are good and which aren't. Item analysis is great. You can look at item and difficulty, see what percentage of students who got the item correct. You can look at item discrimination, how well an item differentiates between strong and weak students is defined by their overall test score. Point by serial correlation between the item and the student's test score. So all of these kind of tell you, so here's where there are standard cutoffs that tell you that if one of the questions, one of the concept questions doesn't correlate well with the student's overall test score, you're supposed to throw it out. But why would you do that? Because what if you're testing 4 different content areas, 4 different concepts, and what if the students know 3 of the concepts really well, but they don't know one of them very well? So then that's going to end up, that analysis is going to tell you to throw those questions out that they didn't know well. So the reason that it doesn't work is because those cutoffs were designed for a single construct instrument, but you're not going to have one. So these can be informative about your questions, but they should be taken gently and not used as, you don't use those cutoffs to just throw things away, or you're going to lose questions that are good. You've interviewed on these questions. If you've interviewed on these questions and student thinking is being elucidated by these questions, you don't want to throw them away. They're good. You know they're good. So these can tell you things, but I hesitate to use them to throw things out. Item difficulty is good for throwing things out, because what if 80% of the students are getting it right on the pretest? Okay, is that really worth having that question? It's something to think about. Maybe it is. Maybe you have a reason, but that is a good one to use. Item correlations, I made this one purple because I use that when I do a perceptions instrument. If I get 2 statements that correlate with the value of 0.6 or higher, I typically throw one of them away, because that means they're basically measuring the same thing. 0.6 doesn't seem that high, but on the CLAS, we didn't have a single pair of questions that were that high. And we were trying to write statements. We were trying to write statements that were asking the same thing about the same idea that we were getting at. And then, like I mentioned earlier, it's amazing how difficult it is to write 2 different statements that really do get at the same thing. But if I do get, if I were to get two that were that close, and I did get some that were that close when I made the PTAP, and so then I threw one of them out. Because then you don't want extra statements. Okay, so again, textbook cutoffs do not necessarily apply, and I told you why. Factor analysis is another way, and I use this especially for perceptions instruments. You could use it for content if you want. Factor analysis goes in assuming it's not one construct. It's assuming there are groups of statements that students answered together. So it's data intensive. It requires a lot of data to do a factor analysis. It identifies which groups of questions or statements are answered consistently by students. So with perceptions, you get empirical categories for analysis. Looks like I animated this in reverse. And concept tests, you get groups of concepts. So that's a reason to do factor analysis. I think for perceptions instruments, it's pretty critical to do a factor analysis. For content assessments, I don't think it's done that often. People have done different factor analyses on the FCI and had arguments about it. So if you're going to make claims that certain statements are representing certain specific domains, then you're going to want to do a factor analysis and see if these questions are really clumping together. But you can avoid that argument by just not making claims about which domain, which set of questions is actually addressing. The FCI just backed off on those claims, and that's how they handled that. So here's what we just went through. So I'll let you look at that, and this is a really good place to jump in. Do you feel like you really understand how to do each of these steps, or did I miss some stuff? Was I unclear? Was I inconsistent? And I also just looked at the time, and so I've pretty much used up the time to leave you time for questions. I have examples of ways to analyze your data. So I'll let you guys tell me if we should go to like a discussion or if you want to see some of that analysis. It looks like Blair is mobile.
Yeah, no, I was out in the hallway where it was quiet, and then everyone got to the hallway, and so now I'm back into the room where it's quiet. Okay. I think that was great. The point you made, especially on, I hate taking surveys, and I feel like I get them often where they're asking the same question multiple times, and I'm like, why? Why do I have to repeat what I just did? It drives me bonkers when I'm taking the survey. Yep. So I was really glad you made that point.
I was really excited when I found somebody had done some actual data collection to show that it made it less reliable too.
Yeah. What was that? What was that paper?
Oh gosh. I found that like 10 years ago.
I'm gonna look that up because I want to have that now. I want to have that data.
If I can figure out how to find it easily, I'll send it to you. But that was a long time ago that I found that. So I might have referenced it though. I'll look at our paper that we wrote and see if I referenced it.
Okay.
I might have, and then that'd be the easiest way. I'll look and see if it's there. Stephanie, did you have a question? I see your.
No, just sort of came back visible. I was done eating my lunch. Sorry, I was invisible before.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, that's why most of our videos were off. I didn't want everyone seeing me eating a sandwich.
It's a brown bag. You're supposed to be eating.
I want to say that was like just really awesome, Wendy. I wasn't expecting to actually learn new things because I've interacted with you for so long and around these issues. But yeah, like I was taking several notes, so that was really
good.
Really cool.
Well, that's good. Well, and you've developed some of these too. So.
Yeah, and apparently done some wrong things. So thanks for that.
Well, I do have a question. When you do the think alouds, and you may have put that already on there, how many times do you do a think aloud, and with how many people? Is there a number you kind of strive for?
Yeah, I try to get around 30 for a perceptions instrument. You get a sense as you're doing the interviews when you're beating a dead horse. You're not getting anything new and different. So then you can quit. With content exams, it's much harder because you really want to get people who are going to choose those wrong answers. You want representation of the people who would typically choose those wrong answers. And so sometimes you have to do quite a few interviews to get those people. So
how do you select, like, do you try to get diversity in the people that you do the
yeah,
think alouds
I
with?
ask for volunteers from a course, and then I
Okay.
do make some selections from those volunteers to try to make sure I'm representing the course. You know, I try not to interview just all males or just all females, or, you know, depending on what the diversity is in your course, I try to match that diversity in my interviews.
Okay.
And when I did the CLAS, I tried to reach as many populations as I could, because with the CLAS, you can use it for so many different courses. It's not just for an intro course. So I did a lot of interviews for that, because I did them at 2 different institutions. I did them with physics majors. I did them with non-science majors. Like, I tried to get a big range so that we could be an instrument with a big range of people. They were, of course, all from Colorado, and they they definitely weren't as diverse as maybe the nation's population, because at that time, those 2 universities weren't very diverse. Now UNC is more diverse. NCU is probably getting there. But yeah, so that's how I picked those.
You know, you say 30, and it makes me realize that I feel like I think of your step 5 as having an A and a B part. Like, there's sort of the initial interviews where you're sort of probing to figure out what's wrong. And usually I recommend that people do those with like 5 to 6 people when they start hearing the same thing over and over, and they iterate the instrument and do another 6, sort of more of a rapid prototyping. And then at the end, when you feel like you've got your final instrument, I'm more at the, like, you know, go through and do 30 interviews. Is that?
I would agree with that. I definitely do some informal interviews. I guess I thought of them as kind of informal, but I do kind of an informal set of interviews in the beginning as I'm working on my statements. And I failed to say that, but yeah, because like you said, it takes a lot of work to get to what you think is a final set of statements or questions, and then do your thorough interview. So that's a good clarification to put in there. Yeah, I grab students and use them every step of the way, really. Like, what do you think of this? And what does this mean to you? And yeah, anytime I can. Some of them are recorded and used for research, and some of those ones in the beginning, I don't even do the recording, because I mean, I should, because then I could report everything they say, but there's just so much that needs to be done to get good statements, that if I don't have stuff ready and I've got a warm body, I'm going to grab them.
That's a good point. Any questions? Other questions from the rest of the group?
Everyone's very quiet. I've only really heard from Stephanie, and I think there was one other person who jumped in.
Sarah did, yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, this was fantastic. Thank you. I learned a ton.